Welcome to the Art of Card Design, where I'm going to be breaking down all the wonderful cards that Wizards of the Coast have created on MTG Arena. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Gix's Command, a card that has seen quite a lot of play in Standard, so I'm sure you're familiar with it if you've played that format. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Gix's Command, it's a 5-mana sorcery, and you get to choose 2 out of 4 options. The first allows you to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, and it gains lifelink until end of turn. Second option is destroy each creature with power 2 or less. The third option is return up to 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. And lastly, we have each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures they control. Every card starts off with a concept. In this case, we have the idea of the spell Gix's Command. And perfectly tied to that, we have this beautiful artwork. Obviously, Magic the Gathering, well known for its incredible artwork. In this case, it is absolutely beautiful and gives you a really good representation of what you're casting. Add to that the really well thought out effects of the commands, and you have yourself a really well designed card. The idea of Gix commanding a creature to become more powerful and drain life, the idea of Gix destroying every weak creature on the battlefield, bringing back creatures from the dead, or even forcing a powerful creature to sacrifice itself. Conceptually, this card just comes together perfectly. It really gives the player a sense of power as they bend the battlefield to their will. It's truly fantastic in terms of the idea and the execution of how this card should look. Now let's move on to game design, which will tie directly into the multiple choices. In card games, the more choices you have, the better usually. Now, of course, there's a limit. You don't want to overwhelm players with choices, but giving players simple decisions that have high skill ceiling, like here in Gix's Command, I'll highlight that in a second, but that is a very big positive as it gives the game more replayability because you'll find yourself in different situations having to use different aspects of the card. It adds a lot of agency to the game, and it also creates a really interesting mind game aspect to the game where your opponents will have to think about your potential options and try to play around them. Now, there are 2 different sides to this decision making. The first side is going to be oriented towards newer players or players who are more casual. These decisions will not put an extra burden on them. Since these effects are all very simple to understand, usually the card will just play itself out. If you need the sweeper, you choose the sweeper. If you need to sacrifice most powerful creature from your opponents, you choose the sacrifice. If you need power and lifelink, you buff your creatures. And if you need card advantage, you grab creatures from the graveyard, bringing them back into your hand. So Gix's Command is a simple card in that way, where all the effects are straightforward. They all do very different things. So you're going to need different effects at different stages in the game in different board states. And those are usually pretty simple to figure out. But in card games in general, the better players will be able to leverage a card like this even more because they'll be able to see options that are a little bit less straightforward that might have an even larger impact on the game if the games are a little bit more even. Now, this isn't the case if you're way far behind or if you're way ahead. Usually those options are pretty simple, but that's going to be the case for most of your game plan if you're very far ahead and if you're very far behind. When games are a little bit more even, that's when some choices can have a very large impact on the game later down the line. And that's where the skill ceiling comes in, and that's why I love cards like Gix's Command. You have access to limited choices, as in you won't be able to select all the choices like on some other cards, where there it's a little bit less interesting. Here, you can only choose 2. This card is also really well designed because all the choices are ordered, and they're ordered specifically to make sense with each other. What I mean by that is that if you choose 2 options, the option on top, the first command, will play out first. The second command that's under it will play out second. So, for example, if you have a 2 power creature, you can use the +2/+2 counters on that creature and then use the sweeper as your second option, and it will put the counters first and then sweep. Another interaction that is way more narrow and that you won't use almost ever, but that is really cool about the card, is that you can put +2/+2 counters on an opposing creature, and that might bring it above another creature's power level, and then you can use the sacrifice effect, which will sacrifice the creature you want, essentially turning this into a targeted removal spell. Now, usually you don't want to do that, but it's just really cool that it was designed that way for you to use the intricacies to create combos. I just think we should all appreciate when card designers put a lot of effort into thinking about even the smallest things that most people won't notice ever. Now let's move on to the last step here when it comes to card design. That's going to be balance, making sure that the card makes sense in the specific format that you're creating it for, and that it isn't overpowered or underpowered. Here for Gix's Command, this card seeing play in standard, I'm just going to evaluate its balance based on standard. At 5 mana, Gix's Command does let your opponent develop their own game plan. It will also let you develop your own game plan before it comes into play and potentially turns the tables. It's really key to have a mana cost that isn't too early, but also isn't too late, so the card doesn't lose its impact entirely or becomes completely overpowered and played in every deck. For example, if Gix's Command was 4 mana, that would be way too early, and we would see it in every single black deck, period. And if it was 6 mana, it would be virtually unplayable. It also helps that each command in Gix's Command is restrictive. For the +2/+2 counters, you need a creature. Now, that is not the most restrictive thing that you'll encounter in this card, but it is still a restriction. For the destroy each creature with power 2 or less, well, obviously, this will not work on creatures with higher power level. If your opponent is playing a bunch of 3 power cards, you might not even be able to get the sweeper at all, which means you'll still be behind. For the return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, well, obviously, you need your creatures to not get exiled, and you need your graveyard to not get exiled to get value out of this effect. And for the sacrifice a creature with highest power among creatures your opponent controls, well, that can be really annoying when your opponent is playing creatures with the same power. Effectively, you're not able to target which creature you want to sacrifice, and that gives your opponent a huge advantage. So Gix's Command is not always good in every situation, and that's what makes the card so well designed. It's not a card that every time you draw it, you're going to be like, that is the best card in my deck. Now, very often it will feel very powerful, but to counterbalance that, in some matchups, it can just be completely worthless, like against control decks, for example, where you probably aren't going to get creatures from your graveyard since a lot of control decks have a lot of exile, they have access to counter magic. Other tempo decks will have access to counter magic, so if you're looking for a removal type card, this is just too expensive sometimes instead of running like way cheaper removal to be able to keep up with your opponents. So there's definitely some downside in playing a 5 mana spell, and that's why I appreciate it so much. And lastly, I want to go back to game design for my last final point, and it's going to be the idea of trading individual card efficiency for versatility and power. And lastly, I want to go back to game design for my final point, and that is going to be the concept of trading individual card efficiency for power and versatility. This, I think, is a really cool and really interesting trade-off that I think card games really should implement more. It's the idea of having a card that is much more efficient, for example, Path of Peril, at doing a specific task that you might want from Gix's Command. But at the same time, allowing you to have access to that tool at a greater price, but also being able to do other things with Gix's Command allows you to justify playing that card in your main deck if you're playing best of 3, and in best of 1, it allows you to consolidate your deck building to have a better chance at beating the variety of matchups you can face in best of 1. So while a card like Path of Peril is extremely effective because it's much cheaper than Gix's Command at controlling aggro, it will be a dead card in a lot of different other matchups, so you're going to be reserving that slot for the sideboard. Essentially, versatility and choice are just straight positives for the game as long as they're implemented in a healthy manner, and I think Gix's Command is a really great highlight of how to design a card like that. Anyways, I love Gix's Command, and there are plenty of other cards that I also will be sure to talk about that I really appreciate the design of, so be sure to tune in future episodes of The Art of Card Design. Anyways, thank you for watching. Don't forget to click the subscribe button as well as the notification bell if you want to keep up with my content. And if you want other ways to support me, you can always join the YouTube membership program for my channel, or you can join my Patreon where I have a bunch of video guides. Anyways, I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you all in the next video.